Hi everyone and welcome to Gloom Woods Carnage. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Remember in the last video when I told you I'd been on vacation with my family? Well, the trip was amazing, but we all came back sick and ended up wiped out for days. Thankfully, the little ones are already bouncing back, but it's definitely made it tough to stay as active here as I wanted. Sorry about that. As you know, at the start of every month, I like to put together a compilation of stories from the channel. This one was supposed to drop in early September, but just to take a bit of weight off my shoulders, I decided to put it out early. So, here it is. 16 terrifying stories about our favorite topic, Appalachia. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. The story he was about to share was far from resolved, and it remained one of the things that kept him awake most nights. He told it now in the hope that somehow putting it into words might serve as a form of exorcism, an attempt at therapy, if only a desperate one. He didn't know whether it would work, but people said that speaking our truths, or at least writing them down, could help. So, this was his attempt, however flawed, to rid himself of the weight he had been carrying. He was 24 years old and lived in Wyoming now, but he had spent the first 23 years of his life in West Virginia. He left because what happened shattered his family in a way that made it unbearable to remain anywhere near them. To give some context, growing up, his parents had always been emotionally absent. Life in these mountains isn't easy. Some people develop a kind of hardened exterior, a wall of constant labor to keep the mind busy, to avoid thinking too deeply. That's exactly who his parents were. And because of that, he grew up in a house with two people who, in many ways, were complete strangers to him. He had always been a socially isolated person with no real friends and barely any family. His mom and dad were completely indifferent to him, and he thought that kind of isolation really messed with him. He could go days without saying a single word to anyone. That lack of connection made him turn a blind eye to things happening right in front of him. He ignored everything his uncle did because he was the only one who ever gave him any attention, even if it was small and selfish. His grandparents weren't ideal either. They were just as emotionally stunted as his parents, and his grandfather was a harsh man, especially when he drank. So, as he said, he turned to the youngest of their children, his father's brother, his uncle. He had always been different from the rest of the family. By then, he was already 42, but no one really knew what he did for a living. He spent most of his time indoors, glued to his computer screen, and in a family like theirs that made him something of an oddball. That fascinated the young man. He looked up to him, idolized him even, and willingly ignored all the red flags. He started spending more and more time at his place, sometimes even sleeping over. His house wasn't inside the main building. It was a large, converted porch adjacent to his grandparents' home, but still spacious enough to be more comfortable than most houses. The first strange thing he remembered, he must have been around 10 or 11, was waking up one night to the sound of muffled noises coming from his uncle's room. He couldn't quite make them out. He had never seen his uncle with anyone, and he was fairly certain that, like him, his uncle didn't really have friends. So, he lay there trying to listen for what felt like forever. When it became clear that he wasn't going to understand anything just lying there, he got up as quietly as he could and walked to his door. The sounds he heard were coming from what he assumed was a woman. She sounded frightened, genuinely terrified. That scared him. He leaned in closer and saw through the partially open door his uncle sitting at his computer editing what looked like a video of a woman tied to a chair, duct tape over her mouth. Her expression was pure panic, so real, so visceral it froze him in place. He was overwhelmed by a sense of dread and ran back to bed. Moments later, his uncle came into the room, furious. He told him that if he was going to snoop around in the middle of the night, he wasn't welcome there anymore. The young man remembered asking him what he'd seen, and his uncle told him it was a police documentary. He said the woman was being investigated for crimes and had to be restrained because she was dangerous. He remembered that part vividly because he didn't even know what the word restrained meant. He nodded, pretending to understand, desperate for his uncle not to be angry with him because more than anything, he didn't want him to stop liking him. Eventually, the incident faded into the background because in the days that followed, his uncle showered him with gifts. He was happier than he'd ever been. His parents had never given him anything, not even on his birthday. Years later, after a particularly rough day at school where he'd been mocked and humiliated, he needed to talk to someone. Anyone. It was around 1000 p.m., and without his parents having any idea, he slipped out the window and walked toward his uncle's place. It was about 8 minutes into his walk through the forest when he collided with a boy a few years older than him, bleeding from a gash on his head. He was terrified, breathless, and begged him for help, saying a psychopath was after him. The young man froze completely. He couldn't think, couldn't speak properly. The only thing he managed to do was point toward the road and tell him to run that way. Just to give an idea, his whole family lived in the same area. His house was about a 10-minute walk from his grandparents' and his uncle's place. There was nothing around them but woods, and the closest neighbors lived farther south, but even then, it was at least a 30-minute walk, so it pretty much felt like it was all their property. Even though he pointed him to the road, he knew no one was likely to come by for hours. He stayed rooted in that spot for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Before continuing on to his uncle's, he knocked several times with no answer. He went around to the garden, retrieved the spare key from the tree where he knew he kept it. The house was silent and he wasn't there. The young man figured he might have gone to the pub or to the gas station. He sometimes drank alone there, so he curled up on the couch and waited. At some point he must have fallen asleep because he woke up in the morning to the sound of his uncle calling his name, asking what he was doing there. He was livid. The nephew apologized and started gathering his things to leave when he noticed his uncle was filthy. Dirt streaked his clothes and there were 2 reddish stains on his face. He asked if he was okay and then told him about the boy he'd seen in the woods. Something changed in his uncle's face when he said that. The anger drained, replaced by something that looked like fear. He grabbed the young man's wrist and apologized for yelling. Then he offered to make him breakfast and asked him to tell him everything. He knew what people might be thinking. That he must have been blind, that he ignored every warning sign, and they would be right. He had thought the same thing 1,000 times, but one has to understand the circumstances. He was utterly isolated and had no friends. His uncle was the only person who listened to him, so he ignored the rest on purpose. That's why he blamed himself for everything, because he knew part of what happened was his fault for ignoring it. As he recounted what happened, he couldn't stop staring at the red marks on his uncle's face. He must have noticed because halfway through the story, he got up to wash his face at the sink. When he finished, he asked his uncle where he'd been the night before. His uncle hesitated just for a moment, like he was choosing his words carefully. Then he said he'd gone for a walk, returned around 11:30, saw him sleeping, and didn't want to wake him. But that wasn't true. The nephew had been awake well past midnight. He had heard the door when his uncle came in, and he looked like someone who hadn't slept at all. Still, he said nothing. He thanked him for letting him stay and said he should get home before his parents noticed he was gone. Before he left, his uncle told him that if anyone asked, he'd been home all night. Once again, he nodded and left. He walked home with a massive knot in his throat. Even then, he knew something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't admit it. Not then, because without his uncle, he'd have no one. The final straw came last year when he stumbled upon a video on a YouTube channel. It was a true story submitted by someone, and it sent chills down his spine. It was about a boy who'd been chased through the woods, and the details were far too familiar. There was a description of a house that perfectly matched his uncle's, a section of forest near a creek that he recognized immediately. And most disturbingly, a birthmark on the boy's face right above his brow. The exact same mark he had seen on the kid who'd begged him for help that night. The tone and the phrasing, the words used, it all felt so familiar. That's when it hit him. His uncle had submitted the story. He panicked because for the first time there was something in him that he just couldn't ignore. Besides, he was an adult now. He knew just how wrong it all was. He called the police and did his best to explain everything. When he finished, the voice on the other end started laughing. It was a long, mocking laugh, the kind that turns your stomach. He had never felt so humiliated. The officer made a remark about kids with overactive imaginations. Said he was probably snooping where he shouldn't be. Then he added that he knew his uncle and would talk to him. He said nothing after that. It was enough. He knew that if his uncle found out he knew and had called the police, he'd lose control. He also knew that even if his family believed him, they would never admit it. They'd close ranks, support his uncle over him. They'd cover it all up just to keep up appearances with the neighbors. In that moment, he realized there was only one thing he could do. Something he had wanted to do for years. He had to disappear. He went home, packed only what he needed to survive, and left. The rest isn't relevant here. Since then, he has contacted 2 newspapers trying to get this story out. Nothing came of it. He knows no one will take him seriously until he has concrete proof, and that's what he is going to get. He won't rest until he uncovers everything that happened right under his nose. He knows the odds of his uncle reading this are slim, but not impossible. After all, his uncle submitted a story too, and the odds of him seeing and recognizing it were close to 0. Yet here they are. So, just in case he does see this, and now he was speaking directly to him, I'm coming for you. Back in the summer of 1986, a man was about 37 and going through a major shift in his life. He'd served in the Marine Corps, then spent several years as a police officer in Pennsylvania. After burning out from both, he felt this pull towards something quieter, something simpler. He wanted solitude, space to breathe, and to be surrounded by nature. So he packed up his things and moved out to rural West Virginia. No grand plan, he just needed to be closer to the woods. He knew that might sound like a strange decision to most people, but if they knew what he'd been through, and he insisted that wasn't something he could explain in a few words, it would probably make a lot more sense. When he told his former colleagues and the few distant relatives he still spoke to about the move, no one questioned it. They accepted it without hesitation. It just seemed fitting. After about 6 months living out there, he'd picked up part-time work doing security and odd jobs for the county. Nothing too intense. Most of his free time was spent hiking deep into the mountains, especially around a remote stretch of land up in the Monongahela National Forest. He'd become a little obsessed with a particular ridgeline that most folks avoided. It wasn't marked on any hiking trail, no signs, just raw wilderness. The kind of place where the deeper you go, the more the trees seem to swallow up your presence. Once again, it might sound a little unsettling to some people, but that feeling, that sense of being small beneath those ancient trees was exactly what he was looking for. That day started off perfect. Warm sun, barely any wind, and the air had that clean, crisp smell you only get up high in the hills. He hadn't planned on hiking, but he got off work early, and something about the weather pulled him in. There was a spot about 2 hours up the slope he'd only been to once before, years earlier, back when he hadn't even imagined living in West Virginia with a close friend who had since passed away while serving in the military. When you spend enough time in those circles, you sort of get used to losing people no matter how old they are. Most of the time, they're just gone and you never really learn what actually happened. But anyway, at that particular moment, it felt like as good a time as any to hike back out there. He grabbed his old compass and a paper map. He didn't have a GPS back then and headed out in his Jeep toward a dead-end dirt road near the edge of the forest. From there, he hiked in. Again, no trail, just forest and elevation. The climb was rough, a lot of dense underbrush, loose rock, and barely any light breaking through the trees in some parts. After about 2 hours, he hit a slope that didn't feel right. It was way too narrow and clearly unstable. He pulled out his map, studied the lines, and saw a nearby clearing off to the side that looked like it ran parallel to the ridge he was aiming for. He figured it might be safer and possibly faster if he cut over. Even with his experience, he was out there alone, and he didn't want to risk something going wrong with no one knowing where he was and no way to call for help. Before moving on, he stopped by a stream to drink and cool off. As he splashed water on his face, he got that odd feeling like someone was watching. He stood up, wiped his hands off, and pulled out his compass to reset his bearings. That's when he saw them. Up to his right, maybe 20 or 30 ft above him on a small rocky ledge, partially hidden behind a pine tree, there was a figure. At first he thought it was just another hiker or maybe a hunter, but something about the way they stood, still, head slightly tilted, not blinking, it unsettled him. Their clothes were what struck him most, if you could call them clothes. Looked more like scraps, layers of mismatched fabric, possibly animal hide. Their hair was long, dark, and tangled, falling well past their shoulders. Their face was weathered and pale, but he couldn't make out the eyes. Still, he knew they were looking at him. He didn't say a word, just stared back. He felt frozen, almost in shock, and he thought what unsettled him the most beyond their appearance was how pale their skin was. It looked almost like there wasn't a single drop of blood left in their body. He had spent a lot of time in the woods. He had run into hermits, drunks, even squatters, but this person didn't fit any of that. They looked disconnected, like they'd been out there far longer than any sane person should be, but at the same time, it didn't really look like a person. It had the shape of one, sure, but that skin was absolutely unreal. Then there was a slight movement and his eyes adjusted, focusing past that first figure. Just behind it, partially covered by a larger bush, stood another one. But this time he could see the eyes. They were this completely unnatural shade of blue. A blue so intense it felt like it could cut straight through him. He knew he probably sounded crazy, but he swore that's exactly what he saw. When he reached for his sidearm out of instinct, the figure stepped back and disappeared behind the tree. By the time he freed his holster and took aim, both of them were gone. More out of instinct from his previous jobs than anything else, he climbed up a nearby tree that had good footholds. From there, he could see the ledge clearly. There was no movement and no sound, just the forest. He sat up there for maybe 10 minutes listening and watching, but nothing seemed alive. Then he realized even the usual forest sounds had stopped. One thing he knew for sure was that the woods go silent when a predator is nearby. Right then, he knew he needed to get out of there, mostly because without him even noticing, it was starting to get dark, and the last thing he wanted was to be alone in the dark with those creatures in their territory. He turned around trying to retrace his path when he heard a crack like wood splintering followed by a deep crash. It sounded like the trunk of a tree splitting in half somewhere behind him. He stopped and listened, but the forest stayed silent. That was strange. He had heard trees fall naturally before, usually from wind or age, but this was different. It happened way too fast, and when he looked around, he didn't see anything broken. Then came the sound. It was like a giant rattlesnake was right there. It was like a snake making that noise, but to be that loud, it would have to be a giant snake. He looked toward the sound, and that's when he saw the two creatures he'd seen earlier, standing side by side, their heads tilted back, mouths open, making that noise. He felt frozen, completely paralyzed until in the distance he saw another one just like them running toward the other two, and he realized everything. A hunt was about to start, and he was the prey. He fired a shot in their direction, more out of principle than anything else. And then he took off running like crazy through the forest. He knew they were going to catch him. And when he said his body was running, he wasn't joking. He was certain he was done for. They were in their territory, and he was too far from his car. It was only a matter of time before they caught him and did God knows what. But his body wouldn't let him stop. He was all instinct, a primitive being acting purely on survival. He didn't know how long he ran, but the only thing that saved him was finding a small river and throwing himself into it. He'd rather drown than die at the hands of those creatures. Somehow, for reasons he still didn't understand, they stayed on the bank watching him get swept away by the current. And that's when his body just gave out, literally. He didn't remember anything after that until he woke up the next day thanks to a hunter. Somehow he'd made it to the shore and he was found. He was helped up, and when he told the hunter he was being chased by some kind of creatures, the hunter didn't even hesitate. He just told him not to worry, that those things didn't come near this part of the forest, and that he was safe there. For 2 days, the hunter and his wife took care of him. They looked after him like he was some baby bird, feeding him soup and food to lift his spirits. 2 days later, the man took him to Babcock, a nearby village, and told him to forget the whole thing, that it wasn't worth dwelling on. And that's what he did. He spent the rest of his life trying to deny everything until now, when he feels old enough and doesn't want to die without passing on what he saw in those mountains. Believe it or not, what she was about to share was something that happened to her 7 years ago. And to this day, she still had no idea if it was some sort of hallucination or if there was something deeper going on in these mountains. After what happened last night, she was leaning toward believing that something really was going on out here, and whatever it was, she didn't want to find out. She worked night shifts at a small regional hospital up in McDowell County, West Virginia. 12 hours on her feet, 3 nights a week, sometimes 4, and by the time she clocked out, everything felt heavy and slow. Like even the air thickened into syrup, and tired didn't even begin to describe it. That morning in late July, the sun was already beating down hard when she finally stepped outside. She grabbed a bitter vending machine coffee, nodded a half-hearted goodbye to the handful of nurses still dragging themselves through their last bits of charting, and made her way to the parking lot. Home was a little over an hour away, tucked up near the state line around Panther. A quiet stretch of country with barely any cell service. No street lights, just thick forest, switchback roads, and that stillness you only find deep in Appalachia. The kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides. Normally, the drive helped her unwind. Windows down, music low, letting the 2-lane highway carry her through the mountains with nothing but trees, the remnants of old coal towns, and her thoughts. But that day, she felt a dizziness she hadn't felt in years. A wave that hit as she stepped into the parking lot and turned toward the far right corner where she saw a man standing there, dressed in a blue suit, staring directly at her. The moment their eyes met, something cracked deep in her skull. A sharp, sudden pain that blurred her vision and made her feel like she had to lie down right then and there. She must have collapsed because two co-workers found her seconds later, and she was suddenly surrounded by them. Unable to explain what had happened beyond muttering that she was just exhausted and needed to rest. They took her back inside where she asked to lie down in one of the staff rest areas, the kind with a few cots for people who have done too many hours back to back. She was desperate to go home, but she knew she wasn't in any condition to drive. Not through those dark, isolated mountain roads. She still didn't know what exactly happened, because when she said she slept for hours and hours and hours, she wasn't exaggerating. She was eventually woken up by a fellow doctor at 1100 p.m. who said she'd seen her that morning and got worried when she was still there at night. She was shocked it was that late. Thanked her for waking her and said she must be working too much if she managed to sleep that long, especially since she's not the kind of person who can usually stay in bed for hours on end. But she got up slowly and was relieved to realize that the feeling of passing out had faded. She gathered her things, got into her car, and started the drive home. To be honest, she loved driving, and she loved driving these isolated roads, but not at night. She never drove at night unless she absolutely had to. She thought in all her years living and working out here, she'd only done this stretch of road in full darkness once, but she needed to get home, so she headed out. Not even 5 minutes into the drive, she had a scare that nearly made her swerve off the road and crash. On the shoulder, standing completely still, was the man in the blue suit, the same one she had seen that morning. She managed to keep control of the car just in time and told herself to get a grip. It couldn't have been him. It wasn't possible. There had to be someone there, but not that man. She turned the music up a little and rolled the window down to get some fresh night air, repeating to herself that she probably needed to get some blood work done. Maybe she was low on something. Vitamins, iron, whatever. There had to be some medical reason for all of this. A few miles further down the road, it happened again. She had the high beams on, and she saw him well in advance on the side of the road again, but this time just a little closer to the lane than before. There was no doubt it was the same man, and that's when real fear started to settle in. This was impossible. She pressed the accelerator and drove as fast as she could the rest of the way, her heart pounding in her chest the entire time, constantly checking the rearview mirror with this growing irrational feeling that she was going to see him in the back seat, just sitting there staring at her. And even though she knew it made no sense, the thought was overwhelming and constant. She still had 32 minutes to go before she'd be home, and she was in full-blown panic, completely unsure of what was real and what wasn't. That night she saw him 4 more times. Each time he was standing on the shoulder of the road, rigid and still, always facing her car as she passed, and she was absolutely sure it was always the same man. When she finally made it home, shaken and terrified, she rushed inside, locked every door and window, and got into the shower. After the shower, she did feel a bit calmer, convinced that she just had a breakdown and needed rest. But as she walked into the bedroom, she glanced out the window and saw him again, standing in the yard, staring directly at her. She completely panicked and called the police, something that almost never happens out here, but she was desperate. She told the dispatcher that either she was having some kind of medical or psychological emergency, or there was a man outside her house stalking her. To her surprise, the dispatcher was incredibly kind and stayed on the line with her the whole time, reassuring her that everything would be okay. By the time the police arrived, she was a bit calmer but still very much on edge, so they brought her back to the hospital. They ran every test they could, everything her insurance covered, but nothing was found. The doctor, who was also very understanding, said it was most likely an exhaustion-induced episode and that a few days of rest would do her good. She stayed home for 5 days. She didn't know how many times she looked out her bedroom window, but she insisted it was a lot. She never saw the man again, and little by little she forced herself to forget the whole thing. Until now, last night a man came into the hospital. The diagnosis was exhaustion, and the story exactly the same as hers. This all happened 5 years ago, but it was such a stressful time in her life that sometimes she still felt like she was living through it. A lot of people around there had already heard this story. They were a really small mountain community, and they all kind of depended on each other to survive. But outside of this place, she had never told anyone until now. She decided to talk because something extremely similar happened again this year, and she was afraid it might all repeat itself. She had lived her whole life in the most beautiful and terrifying mountains in the country, the Appalachians. Ever since she was a kid, she had loved these mountains. And even though she left for the city in her early 20s and stayed there for about a year, she came back pretty quick, already missing it. This was her home, and she wasn't going anywhere. Growing up in these mountains meant growing up with the stories that come with them. She figured a lot of people knew exactly what she was talking about. She had heard all kinds of stuff over the years, but nothing had ever actually scared her for real, not like this. She lived in a particularly isolated part of the Appalachians, deep in West Virginia. Her village had only 7 houses, and for years it was completely abandoned. People only started moving back around the time her grandparents did. No one really knew why the place was first settled, then left empty for decades. As one could imagine, there were all sorts of stories and theories. A few years back, some academic even wrote a whole book about the village and why it might have been abandoned. But obviously, she couldn't say where exactly they were. Not just to protect her identity and her home, but also to keep their land from turning into some kind of tourist attraction like it had happened to so many other places. Anyway, back to the story. One thing that's really common around there was foraging for mushrooms. It's a skill that gets passed down through generations. She learned it straight from her grandfather, and it's something she had always loved. It all started on July 15th. It was a really hot day, and she didn't feel like staying inside. Certain parts of the forest are a bit cooler, so it was the perfect time to head out to one of those spots. She'd been foraging for a few hours when she felt the need to cool her face down and walked over to a small creek nearby. She wasn't exactly sure how it happened, but she placed her foot wrong on one of the rocks and slipped. The pain hit instantly. For a few long seconds, she actually thought she'd broken her ankle. She dunked it right into the ice-cold water, hoping that would help with the swelling, but the pain was sharp and deep. It took a long while before it started to ease up. It was getting late, and she needed to head back. The last thing she wanted was to get caught in the woods at night, especially while injured. Predators, real ones, know how to pick out the weak. She quickly looked around for any sticks she could use to stabilize the foot and used a bandana she always carried to shield her from the sun to make a makeshift splint. Another trick she learned from her grandfather. The problem was she was still a long way from home, and she knew it was going to get dark fast around there. Even when the sun was still out, it just didn't have the strength to push through the trees. And on top of that, she was moving painfully slow. She did her best, but just like she expected, she was only halfway home when the forest went dark. She kept telling herself she was fine. She had her backpack. She was prepared, everything would be okay. But not even 5 minutes after nightfall, she knew she wasn't alone out there. At first, she thought it was just another person because she actually heard what sounded like footsteps. That would have been perfect, someone who could help her. She called out, said she needed help, but nobody answered. That's when she knew for sure she wasn't alone. When you grow up in the mountains, you learn to feel this kind of thing. You develop that instinct and you learn not to ignore it. That skill can be the difference between life and death out here. So she knew she wasn't alone, and not just that, but the normal forest sounds had gone quiet, way too quiet. That's what happens when there's a predator nearby. She stopped immediately, reached into her backpack, and pulled out her gun. Then she started scanning the trees, just trying to catch the slightest movement. That's when she heard her name, and she knew exactly what was going on. It was her grandfather's voice. She had no doubt about it, but her grandfather had been dead for 7 years. She knew the gun she was carrying was absolutely useless now. The only thing that could save her at that point was keeping her head straight, staying calm, and refusing to engage with whatever the hell was out there with her. Staying calm while knowing something is tracking you. It's one of the most surreal feelings a person can go through. After a while, she didn't even know if she was putting pressure on her foot or not. She was just moving, almost at a sprint, pure instinct. That night, she heard her grandfather 2 more times. His voice, the one she'd do anything to hear again, it had raised her. It was the deepest loss she'd ever felt, and that's exactly what made it all so much more terrifying. Whatever was out there knew her weakness, and it knew how to use it. When she finally made it home, she locked every door and window and collapsed onto the floor. She just cried. All that adrenaline finally left her. She didn't even know if she was crying because she made it back or because she'd heard him again. Probably both. For 2 weeks after that night, she was hunted. She'd hear noises on the roof of her house, footsteps circling it, and twice she woke up to knocks on her bedroom window. Something was out there asking to be let in. She knew damn well that if she reacted, if she said anything, if she even acknowledged it, that would be the end of her. She talked to the neighbors and warned them about what was happening. And after 2 solid weeks, it all just stopped as suddenly as it had started. Since then, the nights around her house have been completely quiet, until about a month ago when one night she couldn't sleep, just lying there wide awake, and she heard it again, her grandfather's voice calling her name from just outside her bedroom window. This all happened at the beginning of the summer of 2023, and it completely changed one of the most important parts of his life. His name was not given, but he had always loved the Smoky Mountains. He lived relatively close to them, and for years he had done all kinds of hikes throughout the area. Over time, especially on Reddit and Facebook, he started noticing that a lot of people were becoming interested in hiking those trails, but many of them didn't have anyone to go with. Some were afraid, rightfully so, of venturing out alone and ended up not going at all. That's when, back in 2018, he started organizing informal hikes. He'd gather small groups, usually no more than 8 people, and they'd explore different sections of the Smokies. Many times, they'd spend several nights out there. It was one of the things in life that brought him the most peace and satisfaction. But in 2023, something happened. Something so disturbing he hadn't stepped foot on those mountains since. People still asked him online when he was going back. Until now, he had never told this story. Only the people who lived it and the police knew the truth. It was important to say this. If you don't have experience, don't go into those mountains alone. Honestly, he thought it was better to go with someone, no matter how experienced you are, but if you're not prepared, just don't go. Those mountains are relentless, especially in the more remote areas. This time there were 7 of them, plus a dog. It was the first time they had a dog with them, but he knew its owner, a friend of his. The friend had hiked with him plenty of times, and his dog was extremely well trained and used to climbing alongside him. They started out early on the first day, and by around 2:00 p.m. they had reached the area where they'd camp for the night. It was slightly off the main trail, but still close enough that they could get back to it within 5 minutes on foot. It was a beautiful clearing he'd visited countless times before. They weren't alone, though. Over the years, the clearing had become more well-known, and since it was summer, there was another family already camping there. They asked if they minded them joining, and they immediately said no. They were four, two parents and their two daughters. The girls were instantly taken by the dog, and that night ended up being really pleasant. The next morning they said goodbye and continued on. The family told them they'd likely follow the same path, but they'd only be leaving the next day since the girls, who were around 9 and 11, needed to rest more. They figured they might run into them again later, maybe on their way back down. The second day of hiking was uneventful. The dog was in a great mood, full of that kind of pure, innocent energy that only dogs seem to have. He ran from one side of the trail to the other, thrilled just to be out there. And honestly, his energy lifted everyone's spirits. But that night, everything changed. The spot they had planned to camp at turned out to be unsafe. A landslide during the previous winter had made the old path dangerous. So they changed course. Eventually, they found a nice area next to a small stream, peaceful and flat enough to set up camp. Everything was fine until around 11 p.m. Some of them were still sitting near the water when the dog started acting weird. His fur stood up along his back and he let out this low, steady growl. His whole body went stiff, staring directly across the stream into the trees. His owner, worried it might be an animal, immediately leashed him. The dog had never chased after anything before, not once, and had never reacted this way. Still, there's always a first time, and the owner wasn't about to take any unnecessary risks. They all stared in the direction the dog was focused on, but they couldn't see anything through the darkness and trees. Eventually, his owner led him back toward the tents to calm him down. The organizer of the hike stayed behind for a moment, still scanning the trees across the stream, and that's when he saw something or someone. It looked like a person crouched down, hiding. He couldn't be sure. It was too dark, and whatever it was wasn't moving at all. He tried to focus his eyes, but he started second-guessing himself. Maybe he was just seeing things, he told himself. He turned and walked back to the others. That night, sleeping was almost impossible. Not just because he was in the same tent as his friend and the dog was restless and on edge, but because sometime during the night they heard footsteps near the tents. At first, they thought it might be one of them getting up to use the bathroom or something, but when he checked, all the tents were closed. Everyone was asleep. In the morning, he asked if anyone had gotten up during the night, and everyone said no. He told them he'd heard footsteps and immediately felt the shift in the group's mood. They all agreed it was time to move. During the hike that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He didn't know if it was just paranoia or something real, but he couldn't ignore it. He felt responsible for these people, even if they weren't an official group. Later that day, they found another decent spot to camp. It was slightly protected by trees, so they set up there. But the dog still wouldn't relax. Every so often, he'd lift his head suddenly and stare toward the tree line, completely alert. It was chilling, watching him react to something they couldn't see or hear. The group's mood had shifted. Everyone was tense. Sounds that used to be background noise now felt like potential threats. He had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between a regular forest sound and something that doesn't belong. And something didn't belong. He told everyone he wasn't comfortable staying, but they'd camp there for the night, and as soon as the sun rose, they'd head toward the nearest village and try to get a ride back to their cars. Everyone agreed. Nobody had any idea how much worse that night would get. Around 100 a.m., they started hearing noises in the distance, like several people running through the woods. He froze. He couldn't tell what the hell was happening. He looked at the dog, waiting for his reaction, but he just lifted his head, alert, but not aggressive. He told everyone to grab whatever protection they had, and they didn't hesitate. Not even 2 minutes later, the family they'd met on the first night came crashing into their camp, crying and screaming that they were being chased. They looked like they'd been through hell. The girls were sobbing, clinging to their parents, who looked nothing like the calm couple they'd met before. It took a while to calm them down enough to get an explanation, and when they finally told them, he couldn't believe it. They said they were being hunted by feral people. His first instinct was to dismiss it. Sure, he'd heard the rumors, the legends, but he never believed any of it. Still, there was no doubt in his mind that something had chased them, but feral people. They decided to take turns keeping watch so the family could rest. He and his friend took the first shift along with the dog. Everything was quiet until suddenly the dog went back into full defense mode. Fur raised, eyes locked on the forest, but they couldn't see or hear anything. He stepped forward, flashlight in one hand and his weapon in the other. As he got closer to the tree line, he felt something claw into his arm, sharp fingernails digging into his skin. He turned and there was a face, one he still couldn't describe, pressed up close to his. It belonged to whatever those claws were attached to. He must have screamed because within seconds his friend was behind him and the dog was attacking whatever it was. That thing let out this horrifying sound and took off running. That's when they saw them, multiple figures emerging from the woods. Some ran upright like people, but others moved on all fours. The way they moved, it wasn't human. It was wild, animalistic. They grabbed everything and hiked through the night to higher ground where they managed to get a signal and call for help. At dawn, rangers showed up fully geared. But when they told them what had happened, when they said without a doubt they'd been attacked by feral people, they just looked at each other and told them they were wrong. They said it must have been some kind of animal, nothing more. He didn't have the strength to argue, he just wanted out. None of them said a word. Only he, his friend, and that family had seen what they saw. And the rangers, he thought they knew. He thought they'd always known, but for some reason they didn't want them to believe it. He never went looking for answers after that. He spent months in a fog of denial and numbness, but that fog had lifted, and now he needed to know. He needed to know what attacked them that night in the Smoky Mountains. Everything he was about to tell happened around a year ago in the summer of 2024. But if he were being honest, it was something that had been building for years, since he was a kid, actually. To give some context, he lived in a pretty remote part of Appalachia, so he knew most of the people around there, especially those his age. They all went to school together, which meant they had known each other since they were little kids. His best friend and his girlfriend were two of these people. The three of them had known each other since they were kids, and they had always been close. Sure, there were other people who hung out with them, so they weren't like a tight-knit trio or anything, but he guessed he was the one that connected everyone. That was probably what made him and his girlfriend and his best friend do more stuff, just the three of them sometimes. Another important thing, he and his girlfriend had been together since they were 15. They were 23 now, still together. And here was a weird little detail he didn't even think about back then. But by the time the whole story was heard, it would be clear why it actually mattered. It was known how little kids sometimes play house or pretend they're dating. Well, his best friend and his girlfriend were kind of pretend boyfriend and girlfriend when they were really little. By the time they hit 4th grade, they'd already grown out of that. They realized it was just a silly game. When he started dating his girlfriend years later, he didn't even remember any of that. It was so long ago, just a dumb kid thing, but when his best friend found out, he didn't exactly take it well. Actually, it wasn't that he reacted badly. He didn't react at all. He just kind of went quiet, like he didn't even hear what had been said. Over the years, he started noticing little things. His friend became stiff, kind of awkward whenever the girlfriend was around. He'd come up with excuses to leave early or not hang out at all if she was there. One time he mentioned it to his girlfriend and asked if she thought he was acting weird. She told him she didn't really know him all that well anymore, said they were close when they were kids, but kind of drifted apart. That's when he first started wondering if his friend was holding on to some weird resentment. He didn't want to ruin their friendship, so he asked him directly one day. His friend completely lost it, angrier than he'd ever seen him. A few days later, maybe a week after he tried reaching out a few times with no answer, his friend showed up at his place to apologize, said he just had a bad day and that it had nothing to do with the girlfriend. He just didn't vibe with her and liked it better when it was just the two of them. Then he suggested they take a trip, just the two of them, go camping in the Appalachians like they used to, something they hadn't done in a while. The narrator really wanted to patch things up between them, so he was in right away. The plan was to hike for a bit and camp out for a night or two in the woods. His friend told him he needed to prep a few things, but that in a week or two, they'd be good to go. That whole week, he didn't hear a single word from him, which was weird because they used to talk all the time. He figured he was just busy. His dad worked at the gas station in town, so when he stopped for gas, he casually asked him if everything was okay with his son. The father kind of paused and said, "Yeah," but admitted his son had been acting weird lately. Said he'd been locked up in his room almost all the time, only coming out now and then to grab something, then going right back in. The narrator told him about the camping trip they had planned, and the father looked surprised, like genuinely surprised, said he didn't know anything about it. Anyway, the day finally came and they left early that morning. Right off the bat, the friend felt off. The narrator remembered one of the first things he asked him was whether he'd told anyone where they were going. He was about to say his girlfriend's name, but something in him held back, didn't want to stir anything. He told him he'd mentioned it vaguely to his parents. His friend gave him this weird look, then asked if he'd mind changing the route a little. Said there was a ridge further north he wanted to check out and that they might have to stay out 3 nights instead of 2. The narrator didn't have a job lined up yet, so he told him, sure. A couple of hours into the hike, he asked him if they were really okay, him and his friend. He said they were, and the narrator brought up the fact that they hadn't really talked in almost 2 weeks. The friend said it wasn't intentional, just that he'd been busy helping his dad at the gas station. Started telling this whole story about how his dad was getting older and needed more help. It sounded fake. They'd known each other forever. Why lie about something so small? As they kept walking, he picked up on more little things. Small lies, kind of passive-aggressive responses, and mostly just how damn quiet he was. But it was on the second night that things really started getting strange. He'd brought a bit of booze with him. Not a lot, just enough to take the edge off. He was drinking slow, but his friend was really going at it. That's when he started talking. Not straight out, but kind of hinting at stuff, like veiled jabs about the narrator and his girlfriend. There was this growing bitterness in his tone, and the narrator told him maybe he'd had enough. That's when he snapped, got super aggressive, way more than he'd ever seen. It shook him. He didn't want to escalate anything, so he suggested they call it a night, said they had a long hike ahead tomorrow. His friend said he wanted to stay by the fire a bit longer and told him to go ahead and crash. Usually on these trips, they'd bring 1 tent and share, but this time they had 2, so he got up and headed to his. He tried to sleep, but he couldn't shake the heavy feeling. Something was off. The air felt thick, like it was holding some kind of grief. He tossed and turned for like an hour before finally deciding to step outside. His friend had passed out on the ground next to the fire, bottle empty beside him. That's when he noticed the little notebook in his hand. He got closer, curious, and saw it was kind of like a journal. The handwriting was all messy and almost angry looking. His name was scribbled out in several places. That got his attention. His name and his girlfriend's were all over the pages. He knew he shouldn't read it, but at that point, curiosity had its claws in him. He tried to gently slide the notebook out of his hand, but his friend shifted and muttered something, almost woke up. So he backed off and figured he'd check his tent instead. What he found in there shook him. 2 more notebooks, not really journals in the traditional sense. He skipped around a lot, some entries days apart, others months, even years. But some of the writing dated back 15 years. Normally, he might have found that interesting, a look inside someone's head. But as he started reading, he got this cold, sick feeling. At first, it was all about the girlfriend, how they were meant to be together. It was obsessive and delusional. He was describing things that never even happened. Then the narrator's name started showing up right around the time he and his girlfriend started dating. Pure hatred. Just raw, disturbing stuff. The deeper he read, the more horrified he became. This was someone he'd grown up with, his best friend since childhood, and yet he didn't know him at all. He knew something was seriously wrong, and he needed to figure out exactly what. He didn't even bother being subtle. Yanked the notebook from his friend's hand. If he woke up, he was ready to confront him. But he didn't, just mumbled something and rolled over, still way too drunk. If he thought he was freaked out before, the last few pages broke him. That trip to the Appalachians, it was a setup. Only one of them was supposed to make it back. He couldn't believe what he was reading. His friend had spent the last 2 weeks figuring out how to kill him without getting caught. He planned to burn the journals, disappear into a new life with the girlfriend. He'd probably be hung over the next morning, but not out of commission. The narrator didn't wait to find out what he had in mind for him. He grabbed the essentials, stuffed them in his pack, and got the hell out of there. He made one big mistake, though. He left the journals behind. He was shaken, panicked, not thinking straight, just wanted out. So he left them. It was stupid, he knew. But seriously, how would you react if you found out that someone you grew up with, someone you saw as a brother, had been planning to kill you and had secretly hated you for years? The truth is, you never really know how you're going to hold up until you're right in the middle of it. It took him 2 full days to get home, even moving fast, always looking over his shoulder. He figured he had a head start, but based on those journals, his friend was motivated. When he got back, he went straight to the cops and told them everything. But by then it was too late. The journals were gone, burned with no evidence left behind. He and his girlfriend ended up moving out of state at the end of that year. But before they left, the friend showed up at his door, said that no matter where they went, he'd find them. And since then, he's turned the whole town against them. Convinced everyone there, the ones with the problem. She would like to share a series of events from her childhood that still didn't make a lot of sense to her, even now. No one was ever caught, and nothing was ever officially explained. But what happened to her family in those years left scars they still carried. This all started sometime around the summer of 1995, when she was about 9 years old, and her younger brother had just turned 5. That was also the year they lost their house in town. Her dad had walked out when her brother was born. No note, no warning, just gone. Her mom, already struggling, got real sick not long after that. Something autoimmune, and the meds were too expensive. They couldn't afford to keep the house in Princeton anymore. So they packed up what they could and moved to the only place left, the old family house deep in the Appalachian woods on land her grandparents had owned for decades, but hadn't touched in years. It was a run-down place, half-rotted porch, tin roof with holes, and a sagging barn that looked ready to collapse. But the land was huge, just forest as far as you could see, and her mom was always super resourceful. Yeah, it was an old house, but she was determined to make it livable and comfortable for them. Despite everything that happened, she was able to call that place home. And that was all thanks to her mom's inner strength. The view from any window in the house was both beautiful and absolutely terrifying. especially at night or on foggy days. Just dense, unbroken trees crawling up and down the hills. Their closest neighbors were over a mile down a gravel road that barely counted as drivable. You couldn't see another porch light from their windows, no matter the season, just black trees and fog. At first, it felt like a fresh start. They planted a garden, and even though her mom was sick, she seemed more at peace out there. After all, it was the house she grew up in. But then things started happening. It all began really small, easy to overlook, though she could tell her mom was getting more tense and a lot more careful about keeping the house secure. Like waking up in the morning and finding every drawer in the kitchen open, even the ones jammed shut with paint and rust. But she really noticed a change in her behavior after her brother said there was a window monster that sometimes came to visit him at night. Her mom didn't brush it off or say he was just imagining things like most parents would. She took it seriously. She moved him into her room, and from that night on, they started sleeping together. Years later, she found out she'd actually seen some dirt marks on his window and even a footprint on the floor. A footprint way too small to be from an adult, but way too big to belong to her brother or even her. She did her best to hide the worry, but sometimes she'd catch her lost in thought, just staring out at the woods with this look of pure fear on her face. About 2 months after her brother started sleeping in her room, she started noticing sounds at night. Footsteps on the gravel around the house. She had already talked to her mom about it before, and she made her promise never to peek out the window. She said it was probably just an animal and that she had nothing to worry about. The window was tightly shut and nothing could get in. They were safe. But a week later, she moved all of them into her bedroom, and the 3 of them started sleeping there together. Then there were the symbols. One morning, they woke up and found strange markings scratched into the front door, circles with X's through them like a twisted compass. A week later, they appeared again on the barn doors, always the same shapes, always carved deeply into the wood like someone had taken their time. Her mom painted over them, but they kept coming back. She started keeping a bat by her bed and nailed all the windows in the house shut. She never told them, but she knew she kept a gun in the room with them while they slept. She stopped letting them go outside alone, even during the day. They lived like that for years, trapped in fear. The police were called to the house more than once, but nothing ever came of it. She must have been around 14 when her mom sat her down in the living room to talk. Her brother was at school, and she took the chance to tell her that they were being stalked and they needed to be extremely careful. She didn't want her to live in fear. Just be cautious. Even though they knew they had a stalker, that someone was always outside their house in the middle of the night, nothing serious ever happened until one night that things escalated. It was late, after midnight, and she was still up reading with a flashlight under her blanket. Even though they all slept in the same room, it had become comfortable and each of them had their own bed. The room they all slept in faced the front of the house with a window right above the front porch. The first sign was the floor creaking. Then again, she was absolutely sure someone was walking up there. Her mom, who by that point barely slept, woke up immediately and motioned for her to stay quiet. Right after that, they heard knocks on the front door. They both just stared at each other, frozen, no reaction. Then they heard it, someone trying to break down the front door. That was the last straw. Her mom quietly motioned for her to wake up her brother, doing her best to keep him calm. Then she signaled for them to follow her as she dialed the police. There was a storage room in the house, one they rarely ever went into because it had never been fixed up. In the ceiling of that room, there was a small hatch that led to a narrow crawl space. It was technically an attic, but it was so cramped it could barely fit the 3 of them. Still, if someone managed to break in before the police arrived, at least they'd be hidden. Her mom lifted them up first, then climbed in herself, pulled up the ladder, and shut the hatch just in time. Seconds later, they heard the front door give in. It was pitch black in that crawl space. full of spiders, probably worse things too, but none of it compared to whatever had just forced its way into their home. Her mom whispered as quietly as she could, telling them that no matter what happened, they couldn't cry. They had to stay completely silent. They heard movement, footsteps around the house, the floor creaking, doors opening. Whoever it was walked slowly, deliberately, not like they were in a rush, almost like they didn't actually want to find them. They just wanted them to panic. The police arrived 19 minutes after they called. The longest, most terrifying 19 minutes of their lives. What saved them was the size of the house, the fact that the storage room was so old and untouched it was easy to overlook, and that whoever had broken in took their time. They weren't frantic. They walked with purpose, steady, calm, like they were there to make a point, not to catch them. They left that same night. One of the officers, someone who had been to their house before, took pity on them and helped them relocate. They moved out of state, and with some support from the authorities, they managed to rebuild their lives. Years have passed since then. They still live together, the three of them. Even though her brother and she are adults now, but those years of being stalked, isolated, and living in fear changed the way they see the world, changed how they trust people. And after everything their mom did for them, there's no way they're ever going to leave her alone. The story he was about to tell wasn't very long, and it wasn't super detailed either. But he wanted to be believed when he said it was the most terrifying experience of his life, and it really happened. It wasn't some shared hallucination. It wasn't just kids imagining stuff. Over the years, he'd heard all kinds of excuses from adults trying to discredit what he saw. But he knew it was real, and if he ever doubted it before, he sure as hell didn't anymore. That's why he was telling this now. His family had lived in West Virginia all their lives, but when he was still a baby, his parents moved them to Ohio. Still, they went back every summer. Or at least he always did, even if his parents couldn't make it. One summer when he was younger, he spent 2 weeks at a local summer school, and that's how he met a few kids from around there, and they ended up becoming friends. It's a more isolated area, fewer people, fewer kids, so folks tend to be closer knit. He was still really close with 2 of those friends to this day, though he kind of drifted apart from the others over time. But anyway, back to that night, the night everything happened. It was 11 years ago. He was 13. In that area, it was pretty common for people to go hiking or even camp out in the Appalachians. And since they were 13, they figured they were old enough to do it too. Of course, they were just kids, and no one was about to let them go out there alone. He was super disappointed. But his grandpa, seeing how upset he was and wanting to give them some kind of experience, said they could set up camp in the backyard of their place, which backed right up into the woods. So, it was almost the real thing. So even though it wasn't what they originally planned, they didn't even hesitate. They jumped at the chance. It was July 31st, 2014, and they got everything ready for a night out in his grandparents' backyard. He remembered his grandma wasn't thrilled about the idea at all, and she kept trying to talk them out of it, but that only made them more determined. The only thing that settled her down a bit was his grandpa promising her he'd stay outside with them and keep an eye on everything. His grandpa started them off with a small, controlled campfire and then let them do their thing while he settled into his own tent right next to theirs. None of them wanted to sleep. They were all set on staying up all night telling scary stories, every now and then unzipping the tent just to stare out into the pitch-black woods. The only rule he made them promise was that no matter what happened, they weren't allowed to step outside the tent. If they heard anything, someone calling their names, whistling, anything at all, they weren't supposed to answer, not even if they thought it was him. They thought that was a little weird, but one of his friends agreed right away. Later on, she told them her parents had told her some stories before. Like he said, they were all hyped to stay up all night, but they were kids. So, by around 100 a.m., they were exhausted and ready to pass out. He knew he must have fallen asleep for a good while, maybe even close to an hour. He woke up to his friend shaking him, whispering that there was something outside the tent. They could hear this strange noise, hard to describe, but what really got to him was this horrible smell in the air, like something metallic and rotting at the same time. It was sickening. They woke the others up and just sat there listening for a few minutes. They wanted to peek out, but his grandpa had made them promise not to. At least he and his friend were dead set on keeping that promise, but it was too late. Another friend was already unzipping the tent flap, and that's when they all saw him. There, halfway hidden among the trees, was a man. At least it looked like a man, but the body was all wrong. His head was freakishly large, and his body was so thin, it barely looked human, like he hadn't eaten in months. It was like seeing a full-grown man who was completely malnourished and just off in every way. They all screamed at the same time. And within seconds, his grandpa was at the tent dragging them out and yelling at them to run for the house. His grandma must have already been awake because by the time they hit the porch, the door was wide open and she was pulling them inside like her life depended on it. They all just stood there in the doorway, frozen, watching his grandpa running with that thing chasing after him. The way it ran, it wasn't right. It didn't move like a person. It was fast, jerky, almost like it wasn't fully in control of its own body. He'd never seen anything like it, not before and not since. That night they all stayed in the living room, some of them crying while his grandma tried to calm them down with hot drinks, but even she looked terrified, like she'd seen something she couldn't explain either. The next day they found out the neighbor's dog had been found dead on their land. 2 houses down, someone's goats had been killed too, all of them. No heads. His parents freaked out. They told his grandparents they were irresponsible and then told him not to worry, that it was probably just some wild animal, but he knew that wasn't true. There's no animal out there with that kind of body. It wasn't a bear, he was absolutely sure of that. Over the years, people kept telling him it was nothing. They even took him to a psychologist who said it was some kind of shared delusion, but he knew what he saw, or at least he didn't know what it was, but he knew he saw it, he knew it was real, and he knew they barely got away. About 2 years ago, he went through one of the scariest and most unbelievable experiences of his entire life. And to this day, he still didn't know if it actually happened or if it was all just some messed up hallucination. But the truth was, he couldn't forget those nights, and he'd never been able to make any sense of it. He was trying to finish a writing project, and he just couldn't find the inspiration or the focus to get anywhere with it. Since it was summer, he figured he'd rent a small cabin near Wesville, completely isolated, deep in the woods where he'd be away from distractions. No cell signal, barely any noise, and if he ever needed a break, he could just go for a walk and maybe clear his head. It sounded like the perfect reset. He had already been there for about a week when everything started to happen. One night in particular, he was in deep sleep, having this weird nightmare where he was being chased by some creature through the woods. And no matter how fast he ran or how far he tried to get, it always found a way to catch up with him. And he could never see it clearly, never really make out what it looked like. Just this overwhelming sense of dread and helplessness that kept growing and growing until the whole dream started to fade and blur. And he kind of woke up, and he said kind of, because even though he was out of the dream and back in bed, he couldn't move a single muscle in his body. That had never happened to him before. He'd heard stories about sleep paralysis, but he always thought it was nonsense, like just another creepy thing people made up to scare each other until it was happening to him. And he was just lying there, totally frozen. Then he started hearing this strange sound. A soft, faint, almost mechanical kind of noise, but also alive somehow, like part animal, part machine, something completely unnatural. It was subtle at first, coming in waves every few seconds, and it sounded like it was coming from underneath the bed or maybe from the far corner of the room. He wanted to turn and look to check if something was actually there. But to see that corner, he'd have to move his head, and he just couldn't. No matter how hard he tried, he had never been so scared in his life, not exaggerating, not being dramatic. He was in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night, and he knew there was something inside the room with him, something he couldn't see, something he couldn't even begin to explain, and he couldn't move or scream or do anything. Then his eyes locked onto the closet door. More specifically, the crack in the closet door, which he never left open, not even a little. He hated sleeping with any doors or windows partially open, so he always double-checked everything before going to bed, and that's why he knew something was off. Now, the sound seemed to be coming from inside the closet. He tried to focus, and he swore he could see what looked like a distorted face, not clearly human, almost like a blur, but he could definitely see a pair of eyes looking right through the crack, staring straight at him. He couldn't even tell if it was a man. The shape was all wrong, all warped, but those eyes, they were locked onto his. And then he saw the closet door creak open just slightly, enough for the rusty hinge to groan and fill the silence with that horrible sound that made his skin crawl. Then suddenly, and he didn't even know how, everything just stopped. The room went dead quiet and he could move again. He got up, still half in shock, trying to understand what the hell had just happened. He turned the lights on, checked under the bed, inside the closet, every corner of the room, but there was nothing, just him. The bedroom door was still closed like it had never been touched. Still, he flipped every light switch in the cabin and searched the place like a maniac. He didn't even know what he was looking for. Just something, anything that would prove he wasn't completely losing it, but there was nothing, and somehow that made it worse. Had he dreamed the whole thing? Was he seriously going crazy? Eventually, he convinced himself it had all just been a dream, a really vivid and terrifying one, but still just a dream. That day, he went out for a hike. He didn't think he could have stayed in that cabin a second longer once the sun was up. He needed to breathe, to think, to try and get the image of those eyes out of his head. What felt like hours of terror probably only lasted a few minutes, but he couldn't shake it off. That night, he put off going to bed for as long as he could. Something in him just knew it wasn't a good idea to lie down, but he was completely exhausted from the night before, and eventually he passed out. He woke up with the most horrible pain in his neck, and once again he couldn't move. It was happening again, and he couldn't believe it. He was lying on his back, head twisted to the right toward the window, and the door was on his left. Then he started hearing sounds from the kitchen. Small, quiet movements, and that same wave of terror came over him because he knew something was in the cabin again. He tried everything to move, to lift even a finger, but it was useless. Then he heard footsteps. Something was climbing the stairs. Slow, heavy steps creaking on the wood floor, coming closer and closer down the hallway. He could feel it getting nearer with every step, and he was so terrified he honestly didn't know how he didn't drop dead from the sheer panic. And then, just like before, everything stopped. He could move again. His neck hurt so bad he could barely turn his head. But at least now he could see the door was still shut. He didn't waste a second. He got up, threw all his stuff into his bags as fast as he could, did one last panicked sweep of the cabin, grabbed everything, and got the hell out of there right then, in the middle of the night. Since then, nothing like that has ever happened to him again. He's had vivid dreams, even the occasional nightmare, but never anything that felt so real, so horrifying. He still doesn't know what the hell happened in that cabin. Maybe he imagined it. Maybe he lost his mind for a few nights, but he swears, no matter what, he's never setting foot in that place again. Ever since she was a kid, she'd had the same group of friends. They were always really close, more like siblings than anything else. They grew up at each other's houses, and since they lived in an area where kids played outside and got along, they built a bond that she knew was going to last a lifetime. They lived in South Carolina, right at the edge of the Appalachian Mountains. Growing up, they did all sorts of things out in those woods, from school field trips to family picnics and hikes. And when they got old enough to start going on vacations by themselves, it was the perfect spot. This all happened 12 years ago. They rented a cabin that was about a day's drive from home. Looking back, they were way too young for something like that. But at the time, a one-day drive felt like the perfect middle ground. Close enough to keep their parents from freaking out, but far enough for them to feel like they finally had some real freedom. What they didn't tell them, though, was exactly where they were headed. If their parents had known how deep in the woods that cabin really was, there's no way they would have let them go. It was completely isolated and hard to get to. But honestly, that was exactly what they were looking for. There were 5 of them, 3 girls and 2 boys, and they were all fired up about the trip. Just to give a feel for the cabin, it was huge with 4 bedrooms. Downstairs was one big open space, and right when you walked in, the kitchen was off to the left. That open area had a big dining table, a couple of couches, and a fireplace. There was a bedroom on each side of the ground floor, and just in front of the door, there were stairs leading up to 2 more bedrooms. Every bedroom had its own bathroom. Right in front of the cabin, there was this big lake. They picked that cabin specifically because it was supposed to be safe for swimming. They wanted to hike a little, sure, but really they were there for the water. In the middle of the lake, there was a small island completely covered in trees. Her room was upstairs, and it gave her a perfect view of that island. The first time she felt like something was off, like maybe they weren't as alone as they thought, was actually the very first day. They were all hanging out by the lake swimming, and she was reading a book. She had never really been a water person, so while the others were splashing around, she preferred to stay on her towel in the shade and read. At one point, she had just finished this really interesting paragraph, and she lifted her head from the book to think about it. That's when she noticed something on the island. At first, it was just a quick flash, like someone was holding up a mirror and it caught the sunlight. It disappeared almost instantly, and she couldn't be sure what she'd seen. She knew she'd seen something, but what could it have been? An animal. It didn't seem like it, but it also felt unlikely that someone would actually be out there. From where they were, you could see the whole side of the island facing them, and there weren't any boats around, at least not from what they could see. She was curious, so she waved the others over. She didn't tell them what she'd seen, just said she wanted to walk around the lake and asked if anyone wanted to come with her. One of the boys jumped up right away. The moment they'd arrived, he'd said it would be cool if they could get to the island somehow and explore it, but that idea disappeared just as quickly. They didn't have a boat, and swimming across would have been way too reckless. As they walked, she told him about the flash of light she'd seen coming from the island, how it didn't make sense, and that she wanted to see if maybe there was a boat or something on the far side. He got excited right away, throwing out all sorts of theories. But when they got around to the other side and saw there were no boats, they both kind of shrugged it off. Maybe it was just a natural reflection, like a rock catching the sunlight at just the right angle. That night, they were all worn out from swimming, so they went to bed earlier than usual. She was woken up in the middle of the night by one of her friends. The friend said she was absolutely certain she'd heard someone scream. She didn't know if it was a man or a woman, but she was sure it was human. The other boy in the group immediately jumped in, saying that a lot of animals make sounds that can easily be mistaken for people screaming, especially ones that sound like a woman crying out. That's when the narrator finally told them about the weird flash she'd seen earlier. She had that gut feeling someone might be on the island, but since they hadn't seen a boat, she'd figured she was just being paranoid. The boy made a convincing argument. He had the most experience out of all of them. And he said it was totally normal in remote places like that for your brain to make up threats that weren't real just because it's not used to the isolation. They ended up going back to their rooms, but she stood by the window for a while longer just watching the island. She'd never been big on gut feelings, but something about the whole situation gave her chills. After a while, not seeing anything else, she eventually went back to sleep. The next day was pretty much the same. They went on a short hike in the morning, then spent the afternoon hanging around the cabin and swimming in the lake. That night, it was her turn to wake up. She got up because she had to use the bathroom, and on the way back to bed, something made her stop and look out the window again toward the island. Everything seemed still, the trees forming this dark mass where the moonlight couldn't cut through. At least from her angle, she couldn't see beyond the front row of trees. She was about to walk away when something caught her eye. Movement in the far right corner of the island, and that's when she saw him. From that distance, he was just a shape moving in front of the trees. But she was absolutely sure it was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying something over his arm. Though from that far, she couldn't make out what it was. Maybe an axe. She felt that gut punch of dread instantly. It was 200 in the morning, and there was a man walking around an isolated island with no explanation. But it wasn't just that. It was the way he moved, his posture. It made her uncomfortable. She knew it didn't make any real sense to feel that way, but she thought that was exactly how that sixth sense works. You just know something's off, that something isn't right, even if there's no logical explanation for it. She thought about grabbing her phone to record it, just to show the others in the morning so they wouldn't think she was losing it. But when she came back to the window, he was gone. Must have slipped back into the trees. She couldn't sleep after that. She felt adrenaline buzzing through her whole body. She decided to wake the boy who had wanted to explore the island and tell him. He wouldn't get mad. He'd just come up with more theories, and she was right. For about an hour he talked non-stop, pulling from every weird story or Appalachian legend, each one darker than the last. He was telling her about these random fog banks that appear without warning when they both froze. A scream ripped through the silence. It was far off, but no doubt about it. It was a scream. He shut up immediately, and they looked at each other. There was no way to explain that away. It wasn't an animal. That had come from a woman. They ran to the window, but the island looked untouched. At that point, she knew it wasn't just coincidence anymore. She had seen a man, and now they'd heard a woman scream. She wasn't the kind of person who could just ignore something like that, especially if someone out there needed help. She told him they had to do something. Thankfully, he was already trying to call the police, but they had no signal. So they woke up the friend who had the car and explained everything. They told her she had to drive somewhere with cell service and call the cops. The rest of the night was dead quiet, but by sunrise, the police were already there. She wouldn't name names to protect the woman's privacy, but she could say the cops took it seriously because 4 months earlier, a woman had gone missing in that same area. She'd been hiking with her family and just vanished. There had been search teams, but nobody had thought to check the island because there were no boats. It hadn't even crossed their minds that she might be out there. By early afternoon, they found her. She was in terrible shape, bruises all over her body, and worse things she wouldn't describe there. God only knew what she went through on that island. She gave her statement to the police, and the search for the man continued. 2 days later, they called it off. She later found out from the news that the woman spent a month in the hospital, and it took her almost 2 weeks to even speak about what had happened. She said a man had taken her to the island. Before that, he drugged her, so she didn't know how she got there. She just woke up in that place. During the day, he kept her trapped inside a cave and brought her just enough food to keep her alive. At night, he'd let her loose on the island, give her a head start, and then go hunting for her. The rest, she didn't even want to put into words. She thought most people could imagine how sick and twisted some people's minds can be. What he was about to tell happened 3 years ago, but the story itself was much older than that. He'd always had a deep love for the Appalachian Mountains. There was just something about them. The weight of their history, the quiet sense of mystery that clings to the trees, the thick silence that settles between the ridgelines. About 7 years ago, he stumbled across a Reddit post. Someone had asked if anyone had ever explored the big South Fork backcountry right along the Kentucky-Tennessee border. They were wondering if anyone had ever heard of the disappearances in that area. That post immediately grabbed his attention. Most of those disappearances happened more than 50 years ago. The records are either gone, hard to track down, or buried in some forgotten archive. Ever since that day, he'd been kind of obsessed. That single post sent him spiraling down a rabbit hole he never really climbed out of. He started focusing more and more on the most remote, most abandoned places in the mountains. Some of them are still well known and get their fair share of hikers and weekend adventurers, but others have just faded into obscurity, places no one talks about anymore. And those were the ones that really stuck with him. Then, not long before everything happened, he saw an Instagram story from a guy he followed. He was known for exploring different parts of the Appalachians. He'd been out near Big South Fork and said he heard some strange noises at night while camping. That just pushed his curiosity over the edge. And that was the exact moment he knew he needed to go out there himself. Still, he wasn't reckless. Going alone was out of the question. He needed someone to come with him. One of his oldest friends was into this kind of stuff, too. The friend wasn't exactly thrilled when he pitched the idea, but after some convincing, he finally agreed to come along. So, in late July of 2022, they set out early in the morning, both of them excited to finally check this place off their list. They had taken 5 days off work, just enough time to travel, hike, and fully take in the atmosphere. The drive took a day and a half. They followed I-64 east for most of the way, winding through West Virginia's endless green forests until they finally reached a small, sleepy town called Glen Jean. That's when things started to feel different. You get the sense you're finally pushing deep into the mountains. Glen Jean barely qualifies as a town, more like a crossroads with a handful of old buildings and a single gas station. It's also where you'll find the visitor center for New River Gorge National Park. They stopped there to grab a map and ask about Thurmond. The ranger was polite but noticeably vague. He told them it was quiet out there, that not many people go that deep anymore, and to be mindful of the weather because the roads can get rough when it rains. From Glen Jean, they took Thurmond Road, a narrow, twisting strip of pavement that hugs Dunlop Creek the entire way. That part of the drive really stayed with him. There was water everywhere, running down moss-covered rocks, pooling along the roadside, seeping out from between the trees. The road was barely wide enough for a single car at times, and every turn felt like it was pulling them further away from anything familiar. The feeling was hard to describe, both beautiful and unsettling at the same time. It was like the air itself changed, heavier somehow, like they'd crossed into a deeper, older part of the world. After a few slow, wet miles, they finally reached the bridge that crosses the New River and leads into what's left of Thurmond. During the drive, he filled his friend in on everything he'd learned about Thurmond. How it used to be a bustling rail town back in the late 1800s, how it once processed more coal and money than almost anywhere else in West Virginia. Back then, 15 passenger trains came through every single day. Now, just a couple of Amtrak trains stop there each week, and the town's population is down to 5 people. The original train depot burned down in the 1890s, but a new one was built not long after, and it's still standing. You can even go inside. There's usually a ranger there, along with a few old-fashioned displays showing what the town used to look like. Just across the tracks, you can still see the remains of the old commercial row, buildings that once held banks, general stores, and restaurants. They walked past the old Goodman Kincaid building where a popular restaurant used to be. Supposedly, it was a popular hangout spot back in the 40s, but now it's just a shell. Boarded windows and fading no trespassing signs. You could almost hear the past in the air, distant train horns, voices carried off long ago. His friend joked that it looked like the kind of place where a horror movie would begin. He laughed, but he could feel that knot in his stomach. An uneasy hum when a place gets too silent. They hiked a bit beyond the depot, following a narrow trail that led away from the historic area. That's where they planned to set up camp for the first night, just far enough to be alone. Though honestly, they hadn't seen another person since they left Glen Jean. It was hot and humid, and the trail was steeper than they expected. By the time they reached a flat clearing near the tree line, they were drenched in sweat and completely wiped out. Still, their spirits were high. There was no service, no lights, no noise from the world, exactly the kind of escape he'd been craving. On the second day, they packed up early and pushed deeper into the woods. That's when they finally found the abandoned structures they'd come to see. They were far more decayed than he expected. Some so fragile and broken that just stepping inside made you feel like the floor could give way at any second, or that the ceiling might collapse on top of you without warning. They spent the day exploring as many of them as they could, looking for the best spot to set up camp for the night. The atmosphere felt different out there, like he was trespassing in a place he wasn't supposed to be. It was subtle but strong. This sense of being an intruder. He told his friend how he felt, but he just brushed it off, told him to stop being ridiculous, and warned that the more he believed in that kind of thing, the more his brain would twist things around to make them real. He already knew that was his way of thinking. It's exactly why he brought him. Eventually, they settled on camping near one of the old structures that still had 4 standing walls, but no roof. That way, they'd have some kind of shelter through the night beyond just their tent, but they wouldn't be under any crumbling beams that could fall on them in their sleep. Since it was just the 2 of them, and the tent was huge, they were sharing it. At around 3:45 a.m., he woke up to what he could have sworn was his friend screaming. He honestly didn't know for sure if he actually screamed, but he definitely woke up to something like that. He looked around and his friend wasn't in the tent. Then he heard him call his name and he asked what the hell he was doing outside. He expected him to say he just stepped out to pee, but he didn't answer. He asked again, and the only thing he got in return was the sound of his name, but the way he said it chilled him to the bone. He didn't know how to explain it. It was his voice, but it didn't feel like him. He called out again, told him to stop messing around, but no response. He was starting to panic, so he unzipped the tent and looked outside. The voice had sounded so close, like he was standing right next to him. But when he opened the tent, it was pitch dark. He called out again, louder, this time practically yelling in desperation. That's when his friend finally responded. He stepped out from behind the trees, but he was much farther away than he should have been. There was no way he could have gotten that far, especially without him hearing him move. He immediately asked what was going on and why he was shouting, but the narrator couldn't even respond right away. He asked him if he had called his name. His friend said no, that he'd just gone to take a leak, but then thought he heard something, so he'd wandered a bit farther. He asked him what he meant by something, and he just shrugged and said he wasn't sure. Under any other circumstances, he'd say his friend had played a prank on him, but he knew he hadn't. He looked genuinely confused, And the biggest reason he believed him is that there's just no physical way he could have covered that distance, especially in total silence. He came back into the tent, and when the narrator explained what happened, that's when he told him the part he'd left out. That he thought he'd heard him calling his name, but he knew he was inside the tent, and that there was no way in hell he'd ever go wandering off into the woods alone in the middle of the night. He just said he didn't want to talk about it anymore and that they needed to leave. At the first light of dawn, they packed everything and got out of there, and that was it. Since then, their friendship has completely deteriorated. He kept bringing it up because he knew he wasn't crazy and something had happened, but his friend kept shutting him down. He said he didn't care and told him to stop talking about it. They spoke less and less after that. Now they barely talk at all. He just hopes that someday he'll feel ready to face whatever happened and decide to reach out. He needs answers, and more than anything, he needs his friend to acknowledge that something happened out there, that they both experienced it, and that he's not insane for holding on to it. Until then, all he can do is wait and keep searching for stories like his, accounts that might prove he's not alone. He and his wife moved into the Appalachians a little over 3 months ago. They left city life behind, Louisville to be exact, for something slower and quieter. He worked remotely now, tech stuff, so the location didn't matter. His wife had been pushing for years to get closer to nature. They found a 2-bedroom cabin on about 3 acres of land, just off a long, winding mountain road in western North Carolina. It backed up to a steep, wooded ridge, thick with pines and silence. His wife grew up very close to this area and spent a large part of her childhood playing in the Appalachian forests. So, ever since she went off to college and ended up living with him in the city, it was like the forest had been calling her back. They always knew that sooner or later they would try to live out here. So, when they finally made it happen for her, it was like a dream come true. The closest neighbor was half a mile down the road. That was one of their favorite parts about living there. They liked the space, the fresh air, the sound of wind in the trees instead of traffic and sirens. On top of that, they'd had some issues with neighbors in their old apartment building, so not having to deal with people was absolutely wonderful. At first, everything was perfect, kind of like a honeymoon phase. But around 6 weeks in, things started happening. It began small, practically insignificant things, easy to overlook. The back gate, which he always locked before bed, would be swinging open in the morning just once, then again a few days later. He assumed it was the wind the first time. By the third, he replaced the latch with a stronger one. Still, he started waking up earlier to double-check the property. Once he even took a flashlight and walked the perimeter at 3:45 in the morning. He didn't see anything, but he felt watched. He'd always been a very rational person, so when he first had that creeping sense that he wasn't alone, he told himself it was perfectly natural. It was dark around him. He was in a new place, surrounded by dense forest. It was normal to feel afraid, almost instinctive to be afraid. And it was also normal for the mind to conjure up scary scenarios. He convinced himself it was all just monkeys in his brain. He turned back toward the house, but when he glanced up at the ridge behind it, he thought he saw something glinting. Ever since they'd arrived, that ridge had been particularly dark, so anything not quite as dark stood out. He stared for a few seconds, trying to make out what it could be. Maybe a reflection of something. It wasn't moving at all, so it didn't seem like an animal. Eventually, he ignored it and went back to bed. A week later, his wife found one of his shirts out in the woods. It was a flannel he hadn't seen in a while, one he thought he'd lost during the move. It was lying folded neatly on a tree stump about 30 yards into the woods behind the cabin. It was completely clean, as if it had just come out of the laundry, been ironed and placed there. No dirt, no pine needles, not even a wrinkle. He hadn't been out there with it, and he definitely hadn't folded it like that. They were obviously disturbed by it. He, because he knew with absolute certainty that he hadn't done it, and his wife, because she didn't know what to believe. She asked him several times if he was sure it wasn't him, asked if he'd ever had episodes of sleepwalking. After repeating over and over that he hadn't, she said maybe they dropped a box during the move and some stuff had blown out. They both knew that was ridiculous. Not only had it rained for the past 2 days, but they hadn't even passed through that part of the property during the move. Honestly, his first thought was that his wife was trying to prank him, trying to spook the city boy. She'd always said living in the Appalachians wasn't for the faint of heart. So maybe she was trying to scare him a little, but he knew her too well to believe that. Her voice, her eyes, that was real fear. She hadn't done it. Then came the trail markers, bright orange plastic tags tied to branches. They hadn't been there when they moved in. Someone was marking a path through the woods behind their house. He followed them once, just far enough to feel unsafe, and once again watched. He thought about saying something to his wife that someone had been near their property, but she was still rattled from the shirt incident, nervous that someone had broken into the house. So he didn't want to scare her more until he was sure something bad was really happening. He didn't have to keep the secret for long because after he'd been on the trail with the markers, things escalated fast. Late one night, they were woken by a single loud thud on the back porch, not like an animal or a tree branch falling. It was clearly something deliberate. He grabbed the pistol he kept in the bedside drawer and went to check. The porch was empty, but the gate was wide open again. He stepped out with the flashlight, swept it across the yard, but the beam barely cut through the fog. He shouted into the night that whoever was out there should show themselves, that they were armed and the police had been contacted. And then from the trees, a man emerged, completely naked. He came just close enough for him to see his face and body clearly, then smiled and told them that if they didn't leave his property, something very bad was going to happen. Then he made a gesture that left no room for doubt. He closed his right hand, raised it to his neck, stuck out his thumb, and dragged it across his throat. The homeowner raised his gun even higher, but there was no denying he was terrified. Everything about it was off. He told the man the house was theirs, that they had bought it, and repeated that the police were on their way. He simply said they had been warned. Then he turned around and walked back into the trees. If it had happened now, he would have gone after him, tackled him, waited for the police to show up. But in that moment, all he could think about was how bizarre it all was. He looked back toward the house and saw his wife standing at the door. He told her to get back inside, to check every door and window while he called the police. Even though they were in a relatively isolated area, the police were surprisingly quick, or at least much faster than he was expecting. In about 18 minutes, they were there. They searched the perimeter of the house, but after over an hour, they came back saying they hadn't found anything except a set of barefoot tracks. He told them for the first time about the marked trail, and they said that if there had been anything out there before, it was gone. Now, since they'd found tracks, they said they'd leave a patrol car for the night to make sure everything stayed calm, but that it was probably just a homeless person or someone high on something. He had stood face to face with that man, and he couldn't say for sure whether he was homeless or not. His gaze was focused, his movements precise and deliberate, his posture straight, his expression frozen. With the police outside, they were able to relax just a little, but all they could think about was that come morning, they'd be gone, and they had no idea what might happen after that. The man had been very clear in his threat. Around 5:00 a.m., he heard a noise downstairs. He got up immediately and looked out the window. He wanted to see if the patrol car was still there, had an officer come into the house. But they didn't have a key and the doors were locked. He heard another sound and knew the man was inside with them. He threw the window open and yelled to the police that he was here. His wife, terrified, jumped up and ran to lock the bedroom door. Downstairs, he could clearly hear someone besides the police trying to get in. Eventually, one of the windows was broken, and that's how the cops got inside. They didn't open the bedroom door until they knocked and said the house was clear. When they went down the stairs, the bottom part of the house was completely surreal. Some of the furniture had been moved around, and the entryway rug was sitting on top of the couch. 2 picture frames were shattered on the floor, and one of the kitchen knives was embedded in a photo frame on the wall. There were no open windows, no broken doors, but it was clear that man had been inside the house with them. The only explanation he could give is that he had some other way of getting inside, some hidden point of entry they didn't know about, but they've searched the entire house top to bottom. And the police did the same. They haven't found a single thing that could serve as an entry point. The worst part is he didn't think the cops fully believed them. Honestly, if the roles were reversed, he wasn't sure he'd believe it either. They don't have a single piece of evidence that anyone else was actually there. Everything points to one of them. Only they know there's someone else, that they're not crazy, that they're being stalked by a man. Nothing that's happened so far makes sense. Least of all the shirt and the marked trail. They seem like completely disconnected events from everything that followed. And why the hell would that man move their furniture around in the first place? He knows he's probably just a madman, and trying to find logic in the actions of a madman is just as insane. But he needs to understand what the hell is going on. They're desperate and they're out of ideas, but they know he's going to come back. And this story is far from over. This all happened just a month ago. And he was telling this story because he really believed that as parents, we need to stay alert to everything, absolutely everything. And he was speaking from experience here. He should have realized something was off way sooner. To help understand everything that went down, he was going to start by giving some context that he thought was important. He and his ex-wife split up 3 years ago. It was a peaceful breakup. Both of them just knew it was time to move on. Besides, they have 2 kids together, so above all, they had to think about them and try to give them a relatively healthy environment to grow up in. Their daughter is 11, and their youngest, their son, is 5. His family had always lived in a rural area of Pennsylvania, right in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. When he left for college, he never thought he'd come back. But after so many years in the city and with the excuse of the separation, he figured it was the perfect time to return. He wanted to be close to his parents, but not too close. So, when he found a recently restored cabin that was cheaper just because it was completely isolated, he didn't even hesitate. He and his ex never fought over custody. Everything was handled through lawyers, but only because they were minors and they wanted everything official and organized. Other than that, they had their own system that worked for both of them and for the kids. Most of the time, they stayed with their mom, mostly because of school. He visited them as often as he could, and whenever possible, they'd come over to spend a weekend with him. During the summer, when school wasn't a problem, it flipped. They'd spend more time with him and their mom would visit when she could. But this summer was going to be slightly different. His daughter had recently started doing taekwondo. She loved it. Since she had tests coming up to level up her belt, she stayed with him for the first week. Then her mom came to pick her up so she could focus on her practice. That first week with all 3 of them together was amazing. They played a ton in the backyard, which actually connects to the forest, and they hiked a few small trails around the house. He didn't notice anything strange at all. Then his ex came and picked up their daughter, and it was just him and his son. Everything was fine until one day his son asked him if he could invite his friend over for dinner. He asked him which friend he was talking about, and he said the one who lives here with us. Something else to know. His son had already had an imaginary friend once. It was late last year around Christmas time. He figured it was just one of those things. At the time, the school psychologist told him it was totally normal for kids his age to have an active imagination and that it would pass. So he decided to just go with it. He didn't ask too many questions, told him it was totally fine if his friend wanted to hang out with them. He started paying closer attention. When his son was alone in the yard, he'd watch from inside the house to see if he was talking to anyone. When he was in his room, he'd do the same, just kind of watching from a distance to see if there were any interactions. He never saw anything unusual. One day, he asked him directly if his friend was with them. He said no, that his friend only visited at night and lived in the shed. That sent a chill down his spine. He hadn't realized it was that specific. He asked him what the friend looked like, and he said he was old like him and always wore black. But then he added that the friend didn't like it when he talked about him. That was his first big red flag. He was still convinced it was just an imaginary friend. But he started getting worried, psychologically speaking, because it bothered him that his son was creating this character who was telling him not to talk to him. Still, he decided to check out the shed just in case. The door was open like he always left it, and everything inside looked normal. Nothing seemed out of place. That night, he decided to stay up a bit later in the living room. Every so often, he went to check on his son to see if he was talking to someone, but nothing happened, and every time he went in, he was asleep. So, around 4:00 a.m., he finally went to bed. The next morning, he asked if he'd seen his friend during the night, and he said no. He didn't wake him up. He asked why the friend didn't like him, and he just shook his head and said he didn't know. Then he told him something else that really alarmed him. He said the friend liked his daughter. He asked him again what he meant by that. Maybe he'd misunderstood, but he hadn't. The friend liked his daughter and kept asking when she'd be back so he could play with her too. He kept a straight face as best as he could, but he must have looked horrified anyway because his son looked at him and asked if everything was okay. He reassured him the best he could. And then he called his ex to tell her everything and try to figure out if this had ever happened before. She was just as horrified as he was. She said he should call the cops, that maybe something was really going on, but it seemed impossible. Every single night, he made sure to lock every door and window. They ended the call, and not even 5 minutes later, she called him back. She said she asked their daughter and that she hadn't noticed anything strange. But on the last night she spent at the house, she dreamed there was a man on the other side of the window just watching her. That was it. He became completely paranoid. He tore through the house looking for any signs, but he couldn't find anything. He knew that if he called the police and there really was someone watching the house, they'd run. So he decided he was going to catch him himself. He didn't have to wait long. That same night, he showed up. He turned off all the lights in the house so it would look like they were all asleep. Then, for the first time ever, he locked his son's bedroom door from the outside and stayed by his own window. Around 2:00 a.m., he saw him. He came out of the woods, walking calmly toward the house. He was frozen. It felt like he was seeing a ghost, but worse. He should have called the cops, but that thought didn't even cross his mind. He was so locked in on him. He watched him walk onto the porch, turn the knob, and walk inside like it was his own home. He couldn't believe it. A grown man walking into his house in the middle of the night, talking to his son, asking about his daughter, doing God knows what. He didn't feel fear anymore, just pure rage. He grabbed the gun he kept in his bedroom, and he honestly believed he'd be able to use it if he had to. But what happened next helped him think more clearly. He heard the front door open again. He was leaving. He watched him walk toward the shed. He had no clue what he was planning, but he knew this was his chance to catch him. As quietly as he could, he followed him. He waited until he stepped inside the shed and then slammed the door shut, locking it from the outside. The man threw himself at the door and started yanking on it, but he didn't hesitate. He told him he had a gun, and if that door moved even one more inch, he'd shoot straight through it as many times as it took. He said it loud and with as much authority as he could. It must have worked because he didn't hear another sound from inside. He called the cops and they showed up way quicker than he expected. They took the guy in, and the next day he found out he was wanted by the FBI in Canada for kidnapping an 8-year-old girl. When he heard that, all the rage he'd felt the night before came flooding back. His son was getting therapy now. But thankfully, the man never had any real interest in him. He just used him to try to get close to his daughter. He couldn't even imagine what might have happened if he had just brushed it off and assumed it was all just another imaginary friend. This story was over 25 years old, but only recently did something happen that really made him question everything. What he believed in, what he trusted, and how he made sense of things in his life. He honestly didn't even know how to structure this story in a way that made people understand exactly what happened. He had never been good at writing, but he was going to try his best. There was this cabin deep in the woods near Renovo, Pennsylvania. It was one of the most remote parts of the Appalachians, and the cabin itself was totally isolated now. There were a few other structures around, but they were just ruins. He thought it used to be a small town maybe 200 years ago or more, but now everybody was gone and all that was left was his family's cabin. It had been built and rebuilt generation after generation and just stayed in the family. When they were kids, they used to spend some time there during the year, never too long, because his mom hated that place. She used to say it smelled like death and things that were better left alone. His dad, on the other hand, said it was all just superstition and would spend entire summers fixing up the cabin. He had bad memories of that place for all kinds of reasons. He used to fall a lot around there, always messing up his knees. At night, he'd wake up freezing cold, even though he could look over and see his brother sleeping peacefully in his bed. He and his brother were always close. There were 5 years between them, and he kind of acted like his protector. But up there in that cabin, it was like there was this huge gap between them and he couldn't get past it. His brother loved that place. He'd spend hours playing by himself. One day in particular, they were both in the bedroom when his brother told him a friend of his didn't like him. It was the first summer they'd gone up there since he'd started school. So his first thought was that this friend was maybe a new friend from back home. He asked him who the friend was, and he said he was his friend and that he was there with them. He didn't really know what an imaginary friend was. He was only 10. So he asked him what he meant by "he's here with us," and he just pointed at his bed. He remembered being freaked out and asking why the friend didn't like him. And he just said he didn't know, but that the friend said it all the time. That night he told his mom the story, and he saw this look of pure terror hit her face. He asked her what was wrong, and she changed her expression so fast, like it had never happened, and said it was nothing, that sometimes kids make up imaginary friends when they're lonely, but it didn't make any sense. His brother had always liked him. They were close and nothing had happened between them that would make him invent a friend who hated him. That night, he had a bunch of weird dreams and woke up again, freezing. His brother was sitting up in his bed just watching him. He asked him what he was doing, and he told him he was watching his friend play with him again. None of it felt like something he was imagining. He was so cold. He felt physically sick. He remembered telling his brother to tell his friend to stop, that he was hurting him. And he did. Slowly, the warmth came back into his body, but he couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning, he told his mom everything, and she packed them up and took them out of there the same day. She talked to his dad, but he brushed it all off, just like he always did with everyone. They never went back to that cabin. Every summer after that, his dad would go alone and they'd stay at home with their mom and their aunts. Over time, he just pushed the whole thing out of his mind, and he and his brother never talked about the friend again. Fast forward to about 3 years ago, his dad passed away, and with his mom getting worse, she moved in with them. She decided it was time to divide everything up, and the cabin ended up going to him and his brother. This summer, he, his wife, and their son decided to go up and spend a few weeks at the cabin just to see what kind of shape it was in. His brother was supposed to join them halfway through the summer. Not even 3 days after they got there, he saw his son, who was 5, walking out to the balcony of their bedroom and trying to climb up. He asked him what he was doing, and he smiled, all happy and excited, and told him his friend said they were going to play a game where they jump off the edge. He felt his whole body just lock up and start shaking like something had taken over, and he wasn't in control anymore. He saw his wife's face twist into this look of horror when she realized what might be happening, even though she didn't really know the whole story. She ran to their son, grabbed him, and told him that wasn't a game, that he could get seriously hurt doing something like that. When he finally snapped out of it, he just told her that this had already happened before with his brother when they were kids and that they needed to leave. She resisted at first, clearly trying to make sense of something that felt unreal, but she saw the terror in his face and didn't ask anything else. Then she just started packing. They left that same day and they haven't gone back since. His brother went up there alone to see if he could figure anything out, but he says he barely remembers anything about that summer when they were little. Said he didn't feel anything weird while he was there and just came back. Now he didn't know what to think. He'd never been someone who believed in this kind of stuff, and for years that whole story stayed buried in his head. His mom always knew something was wrong, but now she's not in a state to answer questions. She just needs peace. All he knows is whatever's out there in that place, it's bad and it doesn't mean well. He was sharing this story because he had no answers. He didn't know what to do, and maybe someone out there has a clue about what might be going on or what he could try to make it stop. He just needed answers. This all happened when she was 19 and still living in West Virginia. It wasn't that she didn't like that part of the country. She actually loved it and it was home for a long time, but after what happened and all the isolation she felt afterward, she really needed to get away for a while. And she ended up moving to California. Now she only went back a few times a year to visit her parents and her brother. At the time she had 2 jobs, one at a convenience store and the other at a gas station. She worked mornings at the store and then did 3 evening shifts a week at the gas station. She'd go in around 9:00 p.m. and get off around 2:00 a.m. For those who might not know, West Virginia, especially the part she lived in, is super remote. Lots of mountains and dense forest. It can be absolutely beautiful during the day, but at night, straight up terrifying. The gas station she worked at was just off the highway, so they did get a decent amount of customers. But the road to her house was completely isolated. It took her about 35 minutes to drive home through nothing but woods. Because it was so remote, and they had a lot of truckers stopping by, she never worked alone. It was always her or whoever was on shift, plus someone in the back working the kitchen making basic meals for people on the road. Simple stuff just to keep them fed. That particular Tuesday, it was raining, which made the station feel even darker than usual. It was already past 100 a.m., and both she and the guy working in the kitchen were just about ready to clean up and head out. The only good thing about Tuesdays was getting to leave on time, but right around 105, this man walked in. and the second she saw him, something just felt off. He looked like the kind of guy who hadn't left his house in days, maybe holed up in a basement playing video games. Not that she had anything against video games, that's just the vibe he gave off. He didn't look like a trucker or a tourist, he just seemed out of place. She asked if he needed anything, and he said he was hungry and was going to grab a table. Before walking off, he asked for a black coffee and a bowl of fries. He sat at the farthest table in the place, but he positioned himself so he was facing directly toward the counter, straight toward her. So even though he was in the back corner, he had a clear view of her the whole time. As she worked, she could feel his eyes on her. Every time she glanced over, yep, still staring. They exchanged a couple polite fake smiles, but she wasn't going to lie, he made her uncomfortable. Not in a super threatening way or anything, because she had definitely dealt with worse at that job. Some guys were way too forward, the kind that didn't know how to take a no. There had even been a time when another customer had to step in and tell a guy to back off because she clearly wasn't interested. So compared to that, he wasn't the worst. But still, something felt off. She stepped into the kitchen and asked her coworker how long the fries would take, and he told her he'd dropped the bag and had to make a fresh batch. She walked over to the guy's table, apologized for the wait, and said it wouldn't be long. She asked if he wanted his coffee now or preferred to wait until the fries were ready. He said he'd rather have both at the same time. She guessed she made a weird face because he noticed and laughed, saying he knew it was kind of a weird request. She smiled back and said she'd seen weirder, just trying to be nice. She was about to walk away when he asked if she lived nearby, a classic question. She gave her usual lie, said she lived 3 towns over. She never told strangers where she actually lived. Then he asked if she liked living there. She just gave a little shrug and said, "It's all right, not great, not awful, it is what it is." Then she excused herself, saying she had to check on something in the back just to get away from the conversation. When she came back with the food, he held out his hand and told her his name. She just smiled, nodded, and went back behind the counter. A few minutes later, she heard a semi pulling into the lot, and for some reason, she felt a wave of relief. Just knowing there was someone else around helped. Around 130, the man finished eating. She dropped the check, just a subtle way to let him know it was time to go. Something about him was still bothering her. He paid in cash, said it was nice meeting her, and left. She felt instant relief watching him walk out, get in his car, and drive away. By the time it got close to 200, they'd finished closing up and were ready to head home. Her coworker lived in the opposite direction from her. They locked the front door and each went to their cars. There were only their 2 cars in the lot. Her coworker's was closer to the entrance, so he got in, waved, and drove off. Hers was parked way in the back, as far from the door as possible. There were 5 trucks parked that night, so she'd had to leave her car all the way down there. She picked up her pace. It was pitch black in that part of the lot. The only thing still lit up was the vending machine. She had goosebumps everywhere. She jumped in her car, locked the doors, and tried to start it. Nothing, tried again, still nothing. That's when the panic kicked in. Her car had never failed her before. She knew it had to happen eventually, but seriously, out here at 200 in the freaking morning. Then she felt that pit in her stomach. Headlights turned on. She heard an engine start. A car pulled into the lot. She knew it was the man from earlier. Without thinking, she called 911. She was sure he'd done something to her car. He had to have been waiting, but how did he know which car was hers and what the hell did he do to it? When the operator picked up, all she could say was where she was and that a man was following her. By that point, he had pulled up right next to her car, smiling. He motioned for her to roll the window down. She knew she had to buy time. The cops were on the way, but they weren't there yet. She cracked the window just enough so he could hear her and tried to sound as calm as possible. Told him her car wouldn't start, and she had no idea why. He smiled and said not to worry, that he knew about cars and could help. Told her to get out and let him take a look. Her brain was racing, palms sweating. She asked if he could just check under the hood first, see if anything looked off. She saw a flicker of something in his expression, maybe frustration, but he smiled again and said, "Sure." As soon as he walked around to the front, she called her coworker as quietly as possible so the man wouldn't hear. Her coworker had just left, and she knew he'd get there faster than the police. She didn't know if the man realized what she was doing, but not long after, he came back around and asked again if she'd step out of the car. They both knew that wasn't going to happen. Then he bent down to grab something off the ground, something she hadn't even seen was there. And suddenly, the passenger side window exploded. 2 shards hit her cheek. She screamed that the police were coming and held up her phone. He grabbed her wrist and tried to yank her out. She was screaming like crazy, like somehow someone out there in the woods might hear her. Through her screams, she didn't even notice her coworker's car pulling back into the lot, straight toward them. He jumped out and fired a shot into the air. That was enough. The man let go of her and bolted into the woods. He knew he couldn't get back to his car. Her coworker had blocked the way. He probably thought it was the cops. The police showed up not long after. She wasn't shaking as badly by then, but her wrist hurt like hell and her cheek was stinging from the cuts. The officers were really kind and said they were going to catch him. She wasn't so sure, but 2 days later she got a call. They'd caught him trying to hitchhike a few miles away. Turns out he was from Jackson, Ohio, and already had 2 restraining orders out on him. Knowing he was caught and couldn't hurt her again definitely helped, but she still couldn't bring herself to live in such an isolated area anymore. She looked for jobs out of state and ended up landing a good one in California. It's been 6 years now. She didn't know if she'll ever move back, but one thing was for sure. She was never working another night shift again. He had been house-sitting for about 6 years. Sometimes he also took on pet-sitting jobs, but most of the time it was just house-sitting. He lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and he usually only took gigs around there unless the pay was really good and they covered all travel expenses. In this particular case, the situation was different. One of his best friends, who lived in West Virginia, asked him to look after his house. They've known each other since they were kids. They were alike. They used to spend hours playing games together. And even though these days they only saw each other maybe once a year, he knew his house pretty well. The story he was about to tell happened about a year ago when he agreed to house-sit for him. His friend was going to be gone for a week and didn't want to leave the house empty. He warned him a few times about what he needed to do to stay in that area, which, to be fair, he already knew from previous visits. Another important thing is that about 3 years ago, he was sharing the house with a roommate. The house-sitter had never met him, but from what his friend told him, he seemed like a cool guy. He worked in deliveries and was often gone for weeks at a time doing those long-haul trips. The week he was staying there, he wasn't supposed to be home either. The thing about the roommate was that his schedule was unpredictable. Sometimes he'd be gone longer. Sometimes he'd come back early. So before leaving, his friend gave him his contact info just in case. Meaning he'd never met him, but the roommate knew he was going to be there and he had his number. He was planning for a peaceful week. They lived in a quiet area surrounded by trees and with only a few neighbors. For him, it felt like a mini vacation, and he was honestly happy to have it. On top of that, he was trying to build his own website and launch a business, so he figured he'd use the time to focus on that. The first day went exactly like that. He stayed out on the patio, soaking up the sun and working on the site. Everything went smoothly. He even ended up going to bed earlier than usual, and the night was quiet. The next day, he was genuinely excited to get back to work. He'd slept well and felt full of energy. He went back to the same spot on the patio. But around 4:00 p.m., he thought he saw someone in the trees, like they were watching him. He immediately stood up and walked a little closer, calling out and trying to see if anyone was there. Maybe it was a neighbor who didn't know him and thought it was weird he was there. He wasn't thinking anything bad, but when he called a few times and no one answered or came out from behind the trees, he convinced himself he'd imagined it. Still, he went back to where he was and stayed alert for a while, but he didn't see anyone else until 6:00 p.m. when he closed his laptop and went back inside. He made himself a light dinner and once again went to bed early. The house had 3 bedrooms, so he stayed in the guest room. He put on Netflix and started a movie. He thought he fell asleep halfway through because he didn't even remember how it ended. He woke up around 3:00 a.m. to the sound of the front door opening and closing. He nearly had a heart attack. He was supposed to be alone, and the roommate wasn't supposed to come back that week, but whoever it was had used a key to come in through the front door, so it didn't even cross his mind that it wasn't him. His friend had already told him the roommate's schedule was weird. He stayed in the room, listening to the sounds downstairs. He thought about going out to introduce himself, but it was 3:00 a.m. and that felt off, so he figured he'd do it in the morning. The only thing he did was quietly get up and lock the bedroom door. He heard the person come upstairs and go into the bathroom. The upstairs layout was like this. Right at the top of the stairs to the right was the bathroom. Then came his friend's room, the biggest one. Then the roommate's, the second biggest. And at the end of the hallway was the room he was in, which also served as storage. The only reason the room was set up at all was because his friend's sister used to stay there a lot. Then he heard the person leave the bathroom and walk down the hall. There was a loud, sharp noise followed by a door opening. It freaked him out. The sound had been loud, but he couldn't tell what it was. He heard footsteps in the room. First slow, then faster, almost frantic. It made him feel uneasy. He seriously considered texting the roommate, but again, it was his house and he was the guest. He figured he'd just introduce himself in the morning and ask what that noise had been. He tried to go back to sleep, convincing himself everything was fine. But then he heard the door open again. Footsteps in the hall and someone trying to open his bedroom door. He jumped up right away, sat on the bed, and said it was him. That his friend had asked him to stay there. He waited for a response, but nothing. He could tell someone was on the other side of the door. Besides, he hadn't heard them walk away. He said the roommate's name again. Nothing. Dead silence. Then he heard the person walk off and go back downstairs. That whole interaction was one of the strangest things he'd ever experienced. His friend had assured him the roommate knew he was coming and that he was a chill guy. That was anything but chill. He tried to sleep again, but he couldn't. He turned the TV back on and just let it play whatever was on, not really paying attention. He got up early and went out to the porch to keep working on the site. But this time, he couldn't focus. He couldn't shake what had happened the night before, and he was starting to worry the roommate might actually be weird. He wasn't scared he'd hurt him or anything. He just didn't want things to get awkward between them. Around noon, he went back inside to make lunch. The roommate still hadn't come out of his room, but he didn't think much of it. He'd gotten in late and had probably stayed up unpacking or something. He ate, then went back to his usual spot on the porch. But by 5:00 p.m., he still hadn't shown up. He started feeling uncomfortable, like maybe he was avoiding him. So he decided to text him saying he was there and that there was leftover lunch. The reply came almost immediately. The roommate said he wasn't home and wouldn't be back for at least 2 more weeks. He felt a cold chill run through his body. Whoever had come in the night before had used the front door with a key. Could it have been his friend's sister, some other relative? He rushed back inside, shut the door behind me, and went upstairs. Whoever it was had gone through the bedrooms. That's when he noticed something he hadn't seen that morning. Both his friends' and the roommate's bedroom doors had signs of forced entry. His pulse kicked up. He went to try his friend's door. It wasn't locked and the room was a mess, clothes everywhere, stuff all over the floor. Someone had been rummaging through it. Then he went to the roommate's room. Same thing, signs of forced entry, same chaos. He called his friend right away, desperate to find out who else could possibly have a key to the house. His friend's words froze him in place. No one else should have a copy. He said he'd talk to the roommate and call him back. When he did, he confirmed it. The roommate said he hadn't given a key to anyone either. It was getting late, and he was genuinely worried the person might come back. So he told his friend he'd stay one more night, but he needed him back the next day. Then he barricaded the door, moved a dresser in front of it, dragged the couch to block everything. Then he shut himself in the room and just hoped no one would try to come in that night. Luckily, no one did, and the next day his friend was back. The roommate returned the day after that. The house had clearly been searched, but nothing seemed to be missing. Whoever had gotten inside knew exactly what they were looking for. To this day, none of them know who got in or what they were after or how they managed to get their hands on one of the keys.